So, welcome to the podcast with Melanie. So, first and foremost, thank you so much for joining. It's always really interesting to get people's different perspectives from different industries, stories, paths, and everything included, which I know we're going to run through today.
Well, thanks a lot, Anna, and thank you for having me on the podcast today. I'm excited to be here. My name is Melanie Jorna. My background is in law, in regulatory, specialized in financial regulation. I've worked in the financial sector now for about 13 years. Before that, I worked at a legal counsel outside of the financial sector. And within the financial sector, I've held different positions at different type of companies. Started out a bit on the client buy side of the business for the first few years, then moved over to trading, spent a couple of years there, two different firms. And currently, I am the Chief Legal and Compliance Officer at D2X, almost for 4 years now. D2X is a startup in the financial sector, a trading venue regulated under the MiFID framework, who lists crypto derivatives. And we recently received our license last year, at the beginning of last year, and launched the market at the end of last year.
Amazing. And one thing I always like to touch upon as well, because you've clearly gone through a journey from where you started. And looking back at the earlier years, sometimes, most of the time, there's a specific moment or somebody specifically that inspires your journey or has inspired a critical change which has led to this career. So what motivated you to pursue a career in your field? And did anyone or anything kind of lead to that inspiration?
Now, specifically for the financial sector, it's quite interesting because it wasn't my focus in the outset first. And sometimes you hear that a lot, that people end up somewhere. I was mostly interested in European law first, and then I focused a lot on corporate law and commercial track. And having that as a background, at a certain point, I thought, okay, the financial market sits very closely to big commercial transactions and the corporate sector. So I also have a little bit about that, and just started it a bit as a side thing. And then, I found it so complex, so layered, and so interesting that I actually stuck with it. And so after having worked as a legal counsel outside of the sector, I got my first position in the financial sector, and there, I just stuck with it.
Asking about the content of it. Obviously, you do a lot within the financial law. You've moved from traditional finance, prop trading. How does that apply from a content perspective when moving into industries like this?
Yeah, well, moving within the financial sector. So I think that's also something that really formed me, and really now is knowledge that I bring together in what I currently do. So I started more indeed on the client side of the business in asset management and fund management. There, the focus was more the client-facing documentation, retail clients protection, and all the laws that surround that. And afterwards, I moved into trading, where you have no clients, where you trade only with proprietary capital, where you are actually not, you stand closer to what actually happens on the financial markets. I mean, I worked for years on a trading floor. You actually see trading live in action in front of you. And there you get to know a whole other part of the industry, trading venues, what happens post-trade, working with clearing banks, and so on. And now I'm actually walking a step further into the ecosystem and working for a trading venue itself, where you bring all of that together, and where both an asset manager as a trading firm can be the members that trade on your exchange. And that combined, of course, with the innovative element of crypto derivatives, that really makes that I have a little walk through the ecosystem of the financial sector, which was definitely something that I would advise everyone to not only stick within one area, but to gain a little bit of experience in different type of companies.
It's important because as you look at the legal frameworks and setup from a traditional side to actual kind of moving assets to crypto assets, you can probably see that the legal framework comes a little bit more enhanced and a little bit more focused, because you're dealing with kind of spot trading right there, and as it's kind of ongoing on the floor and the actual transactions are building. Would you say that kind of impacts more of the risks against it, or how would the focus point be for dealing with something more front office than back office from a risk perspective?
Well, it's actually it's way more, actually happening live in front of you. So it's definitely more fast paced. It's something that you need to keep your eye on. It's also very closely connected to what can actually happen within a fraction of seconds on the market. Think of algorithms that need to be kept in control. So you need a strong framework on that. Trading decisions are made quite fast. So you need to actually already have a culture where that works, where compliance is embedded in the DNA's organization.
I think it's just also very important, the collaboration from a front office perspective. You almost need to really fundamentally understand the assets to be able to sort of guide the traders as well.
Yeah.
Which
no, definitely. I mean, that's especially moving into trading that that really stepped away from more the documentation side, which is more focused when you work with client documentation, fund prospectuses, disclosures, and so on, to actually what's happening on the financial market, and also being forced to learn a lot more about technology, because if you want to work and operate on financial markets, especially in when you work with trading or trading venues, you are unable to control the risks and the compliance risk and the legislation, which is highly focused on IT risk and tech, without getting to know it. And I had a bit of background in it, of course, just from a theoretical perspective, but it's really different when you actually step onto the floor and try to understand what's actually going on. Yeah.
That's a really interesting point, actually, because if we think of your role at the beginning to what it is now, how much would you say sort of technology has become an even bigger part of that? And how much has it sort of evolved your processes?
Now, I think it's a huge part of that. It's a huge part of that, especially, but also, of course, my last experience is currently, of course, is a trading venue, which is highly tech driven as well, right? I mean, the building an exchange also starts with building the proper technology to be able to match transactions according to rules, timely confirmation, and so on. As well as on the trading floor, where actually high frequency trading happens with algorithms that need to be developed and need to be kept under control. To oversee that, you need a background into that. And you see also in the legislation nowadays that it's more and more focused on that. And what normally also happens is that first the innovation happens and the technology develops, and then comes the legislation. And and often it's also quite heavy, because we're trying to cover risks, sometimes with, even I would say in some cases sometimes a bit over-regulated. So you need to kind of shape that as going along, but you see that in the trends. I mean, what has been on everyone's plate, of every compliance professional's plate in the last periods, of course, the Digital Operational Resilience Act, which is a big compliance track for everyone. And also to be able to implement that in an organization, first of all, you can't do it alone, but if you want to play a role with that as a compliance professional, you need to understand the background of the systems that you have within the firm, and how you can properly dissect that to be able to set that in place.
Which I think is a massive topic at the moment. You're so right, and it's so interesting to see. It's technology moves first and sort of the legislation comes later. And I think it's also trying to balance innovation with regulation against scale and innovation, which seems to be a sort of a pull and push area with the regulator, but a lot more of like an educational stand. Do you feel like their mindset has changed to work with more technology-led organizations at the pace that they need?
I think so you mean the standpoint from the regulator
Yeah,
also on
so
this
where
topic?
you would sort
No,
of work
I
with
think
the
it's
regulator.
definitely high on the agenda of the regulator, right? I mean, it's also understandable because there's a lot of interdependencies between tech companies. There's a lot of innovation, and it's growing so fast. Of course, we have, of course, AI. That's where is it heading? We don't know. So I think it's definitely on the forefront of it. I think they also know that also in regulatory bodies, you need people with the proper background to be able to supervise it.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that legislation will always naturally follow a little bit later. That's a bit inevitable. It would be great if we first had the framework, but you can't build a framework if you don't know what you're going to regulate. And drafting proper legislation also takes a certain amount of time. And if pieces of legislation that were implemented too fast or where relevant industry bodies were not properly consulted, is something that we have to deal with and then correct. So I think it will always be a little step behind and inevitable, but yeah, that's where it's also important that professionals work with the regulators and engage on these topics.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's probably easier to say that the legislation as well as the application of it changes via industry. And obviously you've moved from traditional finance to prop trading, also to a startup like D2X. So what inspired the move for out there, and how did you kind of weigh the business risk versus the opportunities?
Yeah, so actually, I mean, I had previously worked at one of the trading companies where I worked. Two of the founders, they worked there as traders, so they knew me. And they actually had the third co-founder approach me and say, well, we're looking for a chief compliance officer to join the larger management team here at D2X Executive Committee. Would you be open and interested in that? And yeah, I must say that there were a few elements that really drove me to say yes. First of all, when you've worked in the industry for quite some years, you've been through certain developments within a company, but also within the regulation, and also inheriting certain systems that have already been put in place. You have gained the knowledge and you have the ideas of knowing how you would do it if you would do it from the beginning. So I think that's certainly something that I find very interesting, to be part of something, to build it up from the ground. That's one element. The second element was working for a trading venue and moving through that ecosystem, which I think definitely brings you something. And how often does it happen that you get to build something in a fully new asset class? It doesn't happen every other year that you have this whole new asset class that's developing. And finally, and that's a big driver, and I think also a big important part also for working life, is that I had the pleasure to meet already the other persons from the management team, and I really was convinced that I wanted to jump into that adventure with this group of people. And I've not regretted it ever since. It's not like I didn't consider the risk of it, because working at a startup is absolutely a risk. I mean, you know what you're going to build. You have the intention to make something work. You don't know if it's going to work. You don't know what roadblocks you will hit, what delays will happen. Sometimes also better that you don't know everything in advance, because if you knew everything you were going to face, it could be it could be discouraging. But that's actually the joy of it, right? Now, almost having done it for 4 years, the roller coaster is the best word to describe it.
Because it takes a certain type of person to sit there and say, you get to create something from scratch. You're joining a startup. If you take everything you can from what you've learned from the kind of inherited systems and how it's moved through the ecosystem and what you think could be done better, and now you get to make it your own.
Yeah.
Not a lot of people feel comfortable kind of taking that jump or having the mindset of let's do this and let's do this together. So is there like a reason why, or kind of a certain personality trait that sort of pushes you down that sort of thrill-seeking route like a roller coaster?
Yeah, well, I mean, I like the adventure.
Yeah.
I like the adventure. I think that's, yeah, we spend so much time at work, and
Yeah.
it should really be some. Not everything is fun, of course, right? That's
No.
it's life. That doesn't happen, but it should really, preferably something you spend a lot of time in. It be something that you're passionate about. So something you really want to create and be a part of. So that really attracted me to this opportunity, and also I really thought the idea was very interesting and very good to really bring this new industry into an existing battle-tested regulatory framework. And again, also, the group of people that we were going to do that with, I thought, yeah, well, this combination, it's just an opportunity I cannot miss.
No, absolutely. I think
it's a
when
leap
one
of
of those
faith somewhere, but
arises,
it's
it's a leap of faith, but it's also with people that you trust and people that you know, right? So you can kind of commit to the vision and the mission and also be able to bring your own element to it as well, which adds a really good flavor. And I think that kind of looking at compliance, historically, it's been seen as a very restrictive area of the business. So as you move into all of these different areas, and particularly with startup and obviously with prop trading as well, from when you used to work there, kind of getting front office on board to actually be able to speak to you around what the trades are going to do and how, and the restrictions behind it, how do you position it as a strategic driver of trust, business value, and that it can be actually a competitive advantage in financial markets? How have you sort of molded that with the board and commercial people to where it is today?
Yeah, well, it always remains challenging, I think, for every compliance professional, because indeed, and especially for some, it can be seen like, oh, it's so much to do, it limits us, there's all these rules, etc. But I mean, I try to bring it back, first of all, to the beginning, right? I mean, you want to operate in a certain industry, in a certain sector. You also gain value in having certain rules in place, because if there are no rules in place, then everyone just does, and you also cannot count on your counterpart to deliver something or to do something. That's one part. The second is, so if you want to work in that trusted sector, that means that you need a license to operate, literally. That also means having a regulatory license. So I always see it as your entry ticket to do business. And if you have that in mind, it's also very much more easy to accept that you need to hold on to that entry ticket to be able to develop all of these great ideas and pursue the business that you want. Also, when you're dealing with clients, or whether it is counterparts, having gone through the exercise of obtaining a license and ongoing exercise of maintaining a license is also kind of a quality stamp. Of course, if you do it correctly, that builds trust towards the people you work with.
Mm-hmm. I feel like that also is where some people just maybe are a little bit naive to the fact of, once you've acquired the license, you still have to maintain the license. It's like, okay, we've got it, off we go.
No. I would even say, of course, getting a license, especially when you get that nowadays, where regulation is so developed, it is quite a journey to get there, especially if you also have innovative elements that you need to kind of fit into that. But that's just one part of the journey. You could even say that while you're obtaining the license, you only have one focus, is obtaining the license, of course, building the business, which is a huge amount of work. But when you have the license, you have to maintain that. So everything you put in place now actually needs to work in practice and gets battle tested, and you need to learn and grow from it. And also in the financial sector, it's not like, oh, I've done my homework, I have my procedures in place, and there we are. No, actually, when you're done implementing a piece of legislation, the new one comes along, or a new review. It's constantly evolving and moving. So it is a lot of work to keep everything in place.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. And you mentioned a few things there. And in a startup environment, you've got innovation, you've got new asset classes with regulatory structures which could have been inherited from more traditional finances.
Yeah.
How do you balance all of that?
Yeah, no, so I think that's looking through the glasses of the startup and my most recent experience, actually quite interesting to look at that. So first of all, indeed, some of the systems that you inherit can feel as a burden. But a big part of it is also not. I mean, it's been developed, it's been tested, it's been improved in certain cases. So when you build a business, and especially a regulated business, all the legislation can also really serve as a blueprint of how am I going to structure my business around it. There are quite some valuable elements into that can really serve as building blocks to set up your business. That is something you can definitely use. Then comes the element of how do you bring the innovation into that? There you will find out at a certain point that there is also a bit of friction. Either something is not foreseen in the legislation, so it might fit, but it doesn't mean that it makes a regulator comfortable. It might not fit, so you need to restructure it. So that brings a certain complexity to it, but it also actually, if you look at it in a different manner, it also really forces you to be creative. And looking back, having those moments is actually where the creativity actually came out, and where great ideas were also born to be able to make it work. And looking further along, sometimes it also really pinpoints you to, okay, what's next? Because actually, if we look at that, what's missing in the legislation or what could be improved, it's actually XYZ that we should work on in the future, also from a development of legislation perspective.
Yeah, so there's a lot of sort of burdens and challenges at the beginning, which can kind of come out as positives because it looks at how you can do it in the future or what may be beneficial to use as integrated systems against it, particularly as they move forwards.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then there's always the balancing of it, because there are some parts of legislation which of course it's a lot of work, but it's still it really benefits you, right? I mean, where legislation works really well, it's where it's aligned with business objectives. That's
the key part there.
If I don't comply with this, it's not that I'm just wanting to check a box and comply with the legislation. No, if I don't comply with it, if I don't put this in place in a structured manner, this also ultimately means that I will lose money, whether it is in trading, or I will lose clients. Right?
Yeah, so that's
also how you should view it. Then, of course, there's also a tendency sometimes to that there can be a bit of over-regulation or a lot of data burdens. That should always also be something.
The data burden side of it can be a really downfall sometimes, particularly how it's spaced or how it's utilized, which is why they always say with the usages of technology, it's always based across how good your data is.
Yeah. No, indeed. And that's also where we, as compliance and legal professionals, should really stay vigilant and engage also with regulators, because, of course, data-driven supervision is important, but it should be made as efficient as possible and not become a goal on its own. It should actually serve a purpose.
Yeah, no, of course. And you mentioned there as well, just around sort of complex regulations. And if we look at startups, particularly the ones that scale quickly, they face that a lot. And it's also managing compliance across product launches, marketing, onboarding, cross-border border laws, which is a huge perspective of it as well for some scale-ups, especially as they internationalize. What would your approach be to kind of managing that?
So I think that, first of all, when you work in a regulated business, compliance should really be embedded in the mindset of doing business, right? If you think, okay, we're going to do something, we're going to patch on the compliance piece later on, that doesn't work. That doesn't work. So it should really be part of the sign-offs to launch a product, for example, to be part of the deliberation on how are we going to structure something. And again, as we touched upon earlier, it can also actually bring value, because sometimes it brings you to good ideas. So that's really something that should be in the DNA of the firm for compliance to work really well. And your core product offering, your core activities, they should be surrounded by strong processes. That's, I always say, that's always the foundation of the house, right? The foundation of the house needs to stand and needs to work. If that doesn't work, hit the pause button and go back and fix it. That being said, that also means that if that is in place, right? If that is the mindset of the company, which you of course actively need to work on also as a compliance team to always make that happen, then there should be moments of early sign-offs, whether it's in onboarding, product development, marketing materials. The regulatory review of that should be just a natural step in the process.
Of course, and I think as well, compliance is actually getting brought a lot more into the very beginning stage, whereas there used to be a lot more product creation, product development, skip round compliance, and then let's see how we can go to market. And then you have so much to go back over from a gap analysis perspective. And you kind of touched on it in, sorry, you go.
Yeah, no, but actually it's just that you touch upon a very good point here. It's where if you truly understand how it works and what you need to operate in a regulated environment, you will understand actually that patching on compliance later on, first of all, it doesn't work. And second of all, it will cost you more time. Because fixing something afterwards, it always takes more time. And of course, depending on what it is, it might also have caused damage, which you cannot easily fix.
I think that is it, though. They try going around compliance and they tried leaving it to the last minute without thinking around the impacts of time, delays, cost, and to market that it can have. And you touched on this a little bit just a moment ago, but just around balancing kind of short-term business growth with long-term stability and credibility that compliance provides. Now, if we look at that from more of like a leadership perspective, how do you manage those sides of the scales?
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting one. That is an absolute balancing act, right? So going back to the foundation of the house, I think that for me really is the core. So that should be in place, and of course, depends on how you view that. But that's a crucial element of what should be in place, and you should make sure that that stays well functioning. Now, that being said, it's an ongoing struggle, first of all, from a time element, to make sure your foundation is well functioning, the new legislation that comes in is well implemented, the whole set of procedures and policies and reviews that are done timely, from a day-to-day business, the nice to haves, to balance that time-wise with also short-term projects that are deliverable for the company. That's a time element management, but it's also an element of, how fast do I want to go to market, and what do I leave on the table, or what do I delay for a moment to make that happen? And in an ideal world, you would say, well, both needs to happen, both need to be perfect, right? Your ongoing compliance.
Ideal world being the key point.
Needs to always work. We need to have time for everything, and we make all of our projects on time. And the truth of the matter is that that's not always feasible, right? So you should really balance something in terms of, okay, there's some things that we just cannot skip on, right? We need to keep them in order. And there's some things that we now need to balance, because you're also part of a business, right? You need to make sure that the business can continue, of course, in a manner that it also exists in a year from now and in 2 years from now. But sometimes you will need to prioritize a project over a review that you wanted to do in depth, because you need to launch a project. And if there's no business, then there's also no firm, right? If you looking at it a bit from an extreme side, but I think that's definitely a balancing act that will be always on the table.
And I think the compliance space, they've had to get a lot more commercially acute in terms of their way of thinking. So people have looked at it, okay, this is what we have to do, these are the non-negotiables, we can't go around it. But how do we keep the business moving forwards, and what needs to be in place to actually manage that aspect, as well as the part that we actually have no control over, because it's the regulatory push and has to fall within specific guidelines. And I think that kind of comes from an understanding from your side of urgent and what is still urgent, but what can wait, and how to think about, particularly in a startup, it's probably a lot more looking at the shorter term, whereas you can in a more bigger company look at it from a longer term perspective of 3 to 5 years, for example, rather than kind of 6, 9, 12 months, and how that sort of rolls over depending on the acquisition or being able to actually go live or get the product up and running and customers onboarding, and having that first day where you see how someone sort of interacts with the technology system, and which was probably a very rewarding day and also a little chaotic.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, that's certainly the case. I mean, especially in a startup perspective, you have to go to market, you have to raise funds. There's so many elements that are crucial for the stage the company is in. But nevertheless, even if you have sometimes a more short time goal, because first we need to get that done to be able to move to the next stage, you should still always also have the longer term in mind, right? Because there is a certain level of quality that you always want to have.
Which is important. It's kind of putting in the building blocks for success. You always know what the longer term goal is, but these short term ones are going to be more impactful than looking at it from a long term perspective. Because without funding, without approval, without the correct sort of onboarding side, it kind of ends it there. And that's sort of how you build a really well thought out organization, which is appealing to investors.
Yeah.
And I suppose looking at compliance, clearly you've been involved a lot within the legal and compliance space. But if we look ahead to the future in an idealistic perspective, particularly if we look at digital assets and trading venues, what role, or how do you think the role will evolve for compliance leaders, and what role will they play in sort of shaping the regulatory future in Europe across those two types of industries?
Especially also in the digital industries.
So in the digital assets and the trading side, how do you see them, or their roles evolving and changing, but how do you see them also shaping that sort of regulatory landscape?
So I think the digital asset space is really something that's still very much evolving, right? It's a sector where already a lot of things happened, also things that shouldn't have happened, or maybe that are inevitable to happen when a sector is maturing or also operating out of the regulatory sphere. So there are lessons learned. There's still a lot of trust to be built. There's a lot of a maturity curve that needs to happen. And compliance professionals can definitely take a big part of that. First of all, in just building trust by developing the frameworks within the companies they are working from, whether that is from a more traditional finance company that's exploring a strategy into the space, as purely from a crypto native firm that's moving more into the regulatory space, to build trust, to engage with regulators, but also really to play a role in the developments that happen, right? There should also be a balance that is in place also between the regulation that's going to cover this sector in the long run. Of course, now with certain things that happen, there's a tendency to regulate, which is an understandable vision also, especially of regulatory and legislative bodies, because to protect, of course, consumers, and to prevent certain governance gaps that, of course, should not be in place in the sector. To also, but yeah, we should also not move to something which is then too restrictive or has too high of an entry barrier, because especially in Europe, you want to actually people to come to Europe to set up shop here, to work under a certain quality level. And if that becomes in the end too restrictive or too difficult, what you're actually doing is driving at least some part of the industry to a place where there's actually little to no oversight. So I think there's a big role to play in that regard, on how we're all going to shape that together.
Absolutely. And I think you mentioned the correct aspect there, was when we went into the crypto winter, as they say, you saw a lot of players get shaken off from the regulator, kind of cramping down and really understanding the business model, the thought process that have gone into it, and how people have actually set up businesses, which is where you saw kind of, I like to call them the cowboys, get shut down. And it's been a lot more stable, institutional, trusted firms that stuck around and are now on the rise as we've come out the other end of that. So I think it's very critical that there's a lot more regulation imposed, but not so it's at the stage of a restrictive manner, because clearly within an asset class which is evidently growing and thriving, and probably one of the main ones people are going to have to get on board with, how are we going to make Europe adaptable to that, but in a way which doesn't then send us down loads of people losing their money and fraud and all of the good stuff.
No, but that's something we should absolutely avoid. And of course, it is very hard. That's not only in the digital asset space, but in general in the financial sector. Where is the correct balance between over regulating and just not properly covering risks, right? And I think it's very hard to ever reach an ideal, but I think you need a lot of engagement from people from the industry, bringing that experience, saying what works, what doesn't work, what they experience in their day-to-day. Are they actually more busy to implement something just to fit the box, rather than actually looking at which risks they're actually should actually try to cover within the business and in the field.
Absolutely. And kind of focusing on kind of cryptocurrency, what you moved into that field as you kind of passed through the ecosystem. What advice would you give to professionals kind of considering a move over?
Well, I would definitely say that's a very interesting time and a very interesting place to work. And there are also so many different opportunities to pursue, right? Because it's not only, okay, you have to kind of let go completely of traditional finance and to jump into a firm that is operating purely in the space. There are a lot of hybrid forms. You see that more and more. You also see really very traditional institutions moving into the space, sometimes at a slower pace, but just through a trading desk or by developing a certain project. It's in the way we do payments, in a lot of the innovation, also in the post-trade, that will happen in the next few years. And especially when you bring a lot of experience and you have experience also from the traditional finance sector, you're perfectly positioned also to help a firm who wants to move from the more native space into the hybrid or the regulatory places like a setup in Europe, to guide a firm through that, because really setting up from the beginning and starting to operate in a regulatory environment where you're used to not, you need really good guidance. So there's so many opportunities in there. I would also say be critical what firm you start working with, right? Because it is a maturing sector. So that also means that there are still some types of firms that need to be filtered out for the sector really to build a lot of trust, also towards regulators, consumers, and so on. But that makes it especially interesting, and also you have quite lots of different opportunities, and you could do it all at your own pace, whether it's traditional finance or purely joining a more crypto native firm who you help find their way in the regulatory space.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And to round us off, there's always one question that I love to ask, because I get so many different answers because everyone's got a different perspective. Yeah. But if we focus on you now and you at the beginning of your career, what is one thing you would love to have known, or you would love to be able to tell yourself from when you started to what you know now, as well as thinking around younger professionals, of a bit of advice that you would give them from what you've learned today?
Yeah, that's a very interesting one.
It always usually gives people a second.
Yeah, no. But so because there's so many things that pop into my head also about what I went through in the beginning. I think that, first of all, especially when you're younger, I mean, don't be afraid to take risks, and don't be afraid to fail, right? I mean, not that you're not allowed to fail when you're older either, because that's where we grow, and that's where we sometimes get the best experience from, or the most strength for our future endeavors. But I would say, just dive into things. Try a lot of different things, jump into certain adventure, take risks, look around. Even if you're put in a position where I really gained a lot of confidence, is where I was thrown in the deep. So you're like thinking, okay, how do I approach this? Especially having worked for a somewhat smaller or mid-sized firm, where sometimes there was just not a lot of time for guidance. That's actually, while you may feel it's a struggle at that point in time, know that it's actually something that you will benefit from a lot, and just enjoy it in a way also. And don't worry too much. I think that's what I would say to a younger self.
The most perfect answer ever. You get so many different aspects, but I do think it comes down to, don't overthink. Failures aren't failures. You've just learned something. It's actually an added value which will help you throughout your career. And it's been so interesting just understanding the different contextual spaces that you've been in, how they've been applied to different industries, how you sort of moved throughout your career, and particularly your mindset of wanting just to jump in the deep end and being really interested by something new, and actually being a creator. Clearly, you're very creative in wanting to start something from scratch, and it succeeded, right? But I can assume that came with a lot of learning curves at the same time as well.
Absolutely. So, and I think, learning curves, if you stop learning, what's there to do, right? I think we should never stop learning.
Sat there thinking, okay, well, what do I do now? Yeah. So it's been amazing having you as part of this podcast. So I want to say thank you so much for sharing your journey,
thank you for having
your thoughts and your insights, and for taking the time to sit down with me.
Thanks a lot, Anna. I really enjoyed our conversation.